Okay, it looks like looks good to go here. Looks like most people kind of have signed in, so that's great to see. Thank you everyone for joining us today um, for our third session in our series. Um, really excited to talk to all of you today. Throughout today's webinar, we will have the Q&A feature open, so feel free to put your questions in there. The way the session will go is that Wendy and I have some kind of prepared questions for each other to discuss. And then in the first half and then the second half, we'll get to your questions. But don't wait to the second half to get those questions in. Put them in right as you think of them, so that when we get to the Q&A, there's a lot for us to choose from there, and we can kind of see what trends are going on for what people want to know. So again, feel free to pop any questions as they come up in the Q&A feature. And as I said, we'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. Also, just a reminder that the session is recorded, so don't worry if you miss something, if you step out for any reason, if you can't stay for the full session for whatever reason, not a big deal. The recording will go out. There'll be a follow-up email in the first few days of next week with that recording, as well as any of the contact information and such that we might have shared during the session. As mentioned, this is our third session in this series on residential tenancies in stratas. Really exciting to as a representative of LandlordBC, to be partnering with Wendy at VISOA. Our next session will be held on March the 23rd. And that is the fourth and last in this series, at least as of right now. And like I said, welcome to everyone who's joined us. Feel free to use the Q&A feature, and I'll pass it on to Wendy.
Good morning. I'm coming from the ancestral territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, also known as Victoria. And of course, that's the First Nations of the Esquimalt and Songhees. And Hunter, did you want to say where you were from or where you're located?
We are located as well in Victoria. I'm currently in Toronto at the moment, but our organization is located in Victoria as well. So also within the Lekwungen territory, the Lekwungen-speaking peoples today, as you mentioned, known as the Esquimalt and Songhees.
Great. So just a little introduction. My name is Wendy Wall. I've been with the Vancouver Island Strata Owners Association since 2013 and president since 2020. And if you're not familiar with VISOA, we provide education, support, and advocacy for BC strata owners. Sometimes people don't know what a strata is, and so I always mention that's condominiums and townhomes, bare land stratas, but also commercial stratas. And then good morning, Hunter Boucher from LandlordBC. And wow, Hunter, you've been Vice President of Operations at LandlordBC for a long time, over 15 years now, in the rental housing industry, and of course, with a focus on legislative issues and best practices. As I said, this is the third webinar in our series. Today, we'll be talking about a landlord's guide to communicating with strata councils, whereas in the next one, it's about resolving complaints and conflict. So that might help give everyone just sort of a scope of what's today and what's coming up next time. And Hunter, do you want to tell us just a brief outline of what we're going to cover today? Oh, you're on mute.
So today we plan on covering common communication methods between landlords and councils, effective communication practices, when should those communications be in writing, how and when and can councils communicate with tenants, and some information around record keeping and so what type of records do strata corporations councils keep, and are those communications and records private? So a fair bit for us to cover in this, but I think that we can get to this, as well as mentioned, any questions that you might have throughout the session. So go ahead and pop them in the Q&A, so that when we get to the Q&A session in the second half, we'll have lots to go through. So let's get right into the questions. Um, uh, to kind of give people some background of how we've kind of come up with this content, essentially, Wendy and I have been having conversations over the last 6-8 months now, I think, on the topic of tenancies in strata corporations, in strata units, what it means for councils, what it means for landlords, what it means for tenants. And a big part of that conversation that we've had is about the communication between all of those different parties. And obviously, this is a little bit more complicated than a kind of more standard tenancy in, say, a basement suite or in a purpose-built rental building, where there's really only two parties. There's the landlord and there's the tenant. We've added this third entity that has its own sets of rights, responsibilities, requirements, and such, and interests that it needs to focus. So just right out of the bat, let's ask the question, and for you, obviously, Wendy, can councils communicate with tenants? What does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Should I just jump into what kinds of things? Because the Strata Property Act actually has a long list. Some of the things we are legislated to have direct communication with the tenants, and other things are maybe just less strict, but you should communicate. So just as a couple of examples, some of the things that are legislated, like we have to tell them when there's new rules, when bylaws have changed. They can make complaints, they can ask for a hearing. Like the strata has to inform them if they've been alleged of breaking a bylaw. And then they can request a hearing if they want, they get a decision of the hearing. There's so many processes where the tenant has rights to communicate, like to direct communication. And there's a whole long list, but like when I looked up tenant in the Strata Property Act, they show up over 120 times. So this is no small part of the Strata Property Act. Tenants are not, are definitely part of our process.
So with those communications, so obviously you said there's a requirement for there to be communications between a council and tenants. So essentially what we're saying is the council has to communicate with people who are living within its strata corporation. Are landlords, the owners, generally kept informed of those communications? How does that look? And does it go directly to the tenant or occupant, or does it go through the owner?
I would say that in some cases, the requirement is to have direct communication with the tenant, but there are some things where the landlord has to be notified. So for example, in the bylaw enforcement process, it specifically says that you have to give a copy. You have to inform the owner of these communications. So that the easiest way is just to give them a copy of the letter. So that's where we have to go back to the Strata Property Act and look at that exact wording. And then there's other things that are more, courtesy, like the elevator is going to be down on Thursday, or heat's going to be off for repairs next week. Those things are not legislated communications, but they're certainly operational. And I would say a best practice is to deliver those to both the tenant and the landlord, but that's not specified in our laws. So it's just, whatever it's going to keep things going. But there was something we talked about, Hunter, that I looked up this morning to double check. And actually, I think we get to it later. So we're about access. So we can come back to that later. But yeah, so your question is, are landlords kept informed? Sometimes. That's the short answer.
And I think that might go to kind of the other message of what I want to cover in this session is that, if you are a landlord in a strata unit, you're definitely going to want to, be in communication with council and set that expectation that if you do want to be kept apprised of maybe some of the things that maybe they don't have to let you know about, that you are kept apprised and you maintain that relationship. Um, if I don't get any communication from you, I'm not going to expect you're going to want communication from me, sort of thing, unless it's absolutely necessary. So, that's the thing outside of, I think, requirements. It's just setting those expectations.
Mhm.
Um, so, is it possible though for there to be communications between the tenant and council that are private?
Uh, No, not really. All communications, whether it's from owners or tenants, to or from, um, also when the strata communicates with contractors or managers or any communications, really, they become basically public documents in the sense of the strata community itself. So the Strata Corporation has to keep copies of correspondence for 2 years, and any owner can request copies of correspondence. So, that I always say to landlords and tenants, if they ask, keep it professional, keep all those communications factual, professional, because technically speaking, they're all available upon written request of an owner. And that's difficult for a tenant because they don't have the same rights. So a tenant can't just come to council and say, I want copies of all of the communications where my neighbor is complaining about me. They don't have
Yeah.
that right, but the owner does.
Okay. So that is an interesting distinction. So
Yeah.
the tenants don't necessarily have that same type of right for access to those records, at least under um, the Strata Act. I mean, I think that there likely would end up being uh, uh, a requirement to share those documents if it was done through the Freedom of Information request. For
That doesn't apply to stratas.
It doesn't. That's an interesting
No,
point.
yeah,
So
freedom
that's
of information only applies to governments like municipal, provincial, federal government, but the Personal Information and Protection Act, as you know, that is our privacy legislation. So that applies to private companies, societies, strata corporations. So
mhm,
yeah, it's not FOIPA, it's PIPA that applies to us.
exactly
And PIPA doesn't require disclosure in the way that freedom of information requires disclosure.
perfect.
So it's more about privacy than anyway, we won't get into that too much.
Fair enough. No, that's a really important distinction, and which is why I brought it up. So I'm
Yeah.
happy that we've made that. Because I think that's a common kind of misunderstanding that we get that yeah. So this is good. Um, with the requirement for councils to keep uh, these communications and these records. Um, is there a requirement that they have some type of privacy policy in place, or is
There,
that covered generally by the legislation itself?
yeah, the Personal Information Protection Act requires all sorts of organizations to have a privacy policy, and that includes societies, strata corporations, private businesses. We're all required now. Does every strata corporation have a privacy policy? No. Technically, we're all required by law to have one, but it isn't under the Strata Property Act. It's under Personal Information Protection Act. And
Yes, exactly.
we actually have a template for creating your own strata privacy policy on our website. So it's not that hard to do, but it does require a number of decisions of, what you're going to do with records and where they're going to be stored and who has access. And, there's a whole long list because you're familiar with that legislation too.
Exactly. Yeah, and it is important, I think, that's you know, I think we see very, very frequently that uh, strata corporations, landlords, just anyone who's operating a business doesn't end up having a privacy policy in place. I think that's probably more likely than not. Um, for people. I find, at least I find that's the case when I'm talking to people who are operating these types of businesses. But there is certainly a need for it, especially when we start getting into those kind of nitty-gritty type details. The general day-to-day things aren't as important there. And the Office of the Privacy Commissioner isn't out there to say, you absolutely must do this every single time. And they're not, they understand that not everyone is going to be 100% compliant to that, so long as you have, general common sense. But certainly having a privacy policy and developing one, especially through something like a template, as you mentioned, is fairly simple. The rules around them are pretty easy to understand. And what's great about having that policy in place is it means that when something does come up, you can refer back to a fairly simple document that talks about process, that talks about uh, just how things are handled within the corporation. So I do encourage both landlords and Strata corporations to consider, making sure that they do have some sort of policy in place.
Yeah, good advice.
Yeah. I think I pass it on to you.
Okay, so this comes up a lot where sometimes tenants, they might be alleged of breaching a bylaw or a rule. Council hasn't gotten a formal complaint yet, but they recognize that there might be a growing issue here. Is it okay for the council to just call up the landlord or email them and say, hey, here's what's going on?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And it comes down to, I guess, the thing that we've just been talking about, which is privacy. Um, so it's given that ultimately it is the business of the landlord to operate, it's their responsibility to operate the rental housing business that they have in that unit. It's reasonable for them to uh, to gather that sort of information about what's happening in their unit or on, in the property in general. Um, so while we have this piece of legislation that we talked about, the Personal Information Protection Act, that does protect an individual's privacy in many ways, it does take into account that there is a very real business need for people who are operating those types of businesses to gather that information. It also recognizes that uh, not while in general disclosure should be done with consent, that's not always an option, and it's not always um, needed in every scenario. So in this situation, disclosure from a council about a potential concern within the unit to an owner is generally permitted. Um, Again, it comes down to what you mentioned before about communications being professional, being to the point, being concise. We want to keep out a lot of personal conjecture that might come up in a conversation. You want to make sure that when those communications are happening, that they're very much to the point. This is what we think is happening, and this is why we think this is happening. And uh, uh, if that's what's been done, that's perfectly valid. And in fact, an important part of that communication between landlords and councils, because at the end of the day, uh, councils don't have the same type of interaction with tenants when it comes to kind of policing the activities of a tenant in terms of the same type of authority under the Residential Tenancy Act, at least. Um, that responsibility ultimately falls to the owner. Uh, so they need to be informed to be able to take action on it.
But I like what
And
you said about the word think. Rather than saying the tenant's doing this, you could say, based on, what we're seeing, it's possible that this might be happening. You might want to check it out. And then maybe it's not quite so, definitive, because that happens too, where people's perception of the problem or the people's perception of what might be going on is not actually true.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's not an uncommon situation, especially with things like home sharing services, for example, Airbnb. Um, in fact, I had this situation come up just the other week. The landlord was concerned that there was the operation of a short-term rental in their unit, that the tenant essentially was renting out um, the whole space or part of the space through a service such as Airbnb. Um, and they were concerned about this because they had received communication from, it was either council or another occupant, another owner of the building. I can't recall that situation. Um, that wasn't the case in this situation. The tenant had had multiple guests over the course of a couple of weeks. Um, uh, they had a health situation, and family was coming to help take care of them over a period of time. But it was, about once a week someone new coming with a suitcase, and it happened over the course of several weeks. So it was several people who were kind of taking shifts to help this person. It was all communicated out. People talked about it. They understood what was happening in the end, and it was all perfectly fine. But this is one of those situations where, yeah, you want to make sure that your communications aren't saying this is exactly what's happening if you don't have proof of that. Um, and certainly giving the owner a chance to investigate that.
So just in general in stratas, I think you mentioned this earlier, that communications are a lot more difficult than, say, a purpose-built rental building. So do you recommend that landlords give their tenants some kind of a contact list for different situations, like in an emergency, contact this person, or if you have a question about fobs, contact this person?
Hmm. Yeah. So the Residential Tenancy Act requires that you provide uh, to your tenant. When I say you, I'm addressing a landlord. Uh, uh, Requires that you provide an emergency contact um, information to the tenant. That should be in writing. It should be either posted somewhere in the building, which in stratas is not likely how it's going to be done. Uh, that's more for purpose-built rental buildings. Um, in generally, it's something that's kind of just provided when you sign the tenancy agreement. So there's a requirement right there that emergency contact information be provided, but not everything's an emergency, and we often don't have one person who does absolutely everything, especially within a strata corporation. Within stratas, there's going to be a different person for for different things. Um, as you mentioned, the person that you contact for fobs, the person that you contact if there's a leak, uh, the person that you contact for kind of non-emergency situations, around things like, say, noise, for example. Those are the sorts of things uh, that uh, you know you uh, you need um, to provide to the tenant, as these are the people who you need to contact, but also then the context of when to contact them. But the last thing you want is, the tenant contacting the person who is responsible for kind of non-emergency noise complaints or maybe fob issues, uh, because they're contacting them because there's a leak in the roof, and it's flooding the unit out. Well, that person probably doesn't check their voicemail as frequently. um, so again, provide contacts and information, but provide the context and perhaps even the order in which you'd want people to reach out um, to people. So if there is, say, a flood in the unit, for example, well, the first person to contact perhaps is the emergency person for the strata in general, because obviously that's going to affect the entire building. Um, Contact them first, contact the landlord second, sort of thing. Um, just making sure that um, uh, that they know who to contact when, and of course in what methods as well. Um, you know, if there's an emergency, probably not an email. You're probably going to call that person. Uh, and of course, I mean, I guess it's 2024, so maybe a text as well. Um, but yeah, definitely provide that type of contact information.
I do have one question about a specific thing. Sometimes a tenant will contact council to say, I need an extra fob, or I lost my fob, I need a replacement fob, or same thing with keys. I would imagine that keys are something that the landlord needs to keep track of so that at the end of a tenancy they hand in. So although it may not be a written rule or law, would you say that would it be okay for council to say, we can't sell a fob directly to you? Contact your landlord.
Yeah, that is a very reasonable approach.
It's tricky.
Well, it's tricky, but it's certainly supported under the Residential Tenancy Act. So in a standard residential tenancy, we recommend that landlords have a clause in their agreement, and we provide to our members in a tenancy agreement that has a clause that covers this exact topic, that essentially limits the tenant from being able to get copies of keys and give out keys to people who are unauthorized as well. And of course, when I say keys and other access devices such as fobs. So the landlord imposing that sort of barrier or step in the process that, okay, those types of requests should probably come through me so that I can keep track of them, is important because it protects the owner from the tenant potentially giving out keys to other people. So it's very directly related to the tenancy, but also protects the owner in relation to their liability and responsibility to the strata as well. Because again, they're ultimately responsible. If a tenant does something within a strata, within a building, that causes damage or disruption, we know, as we've said, the strata corporation can communicate with the tenant all they want, but if the tenant ends up leaving and we can't find them, responsibility falls back to the owner at the end of the day. And so it's important that they keep track of those sorts of things, and that would be part of that communication tree that we just mentioned, giving that list of who to communicate for different types of things. You lose a copy of the key, contact me first, I'll be on top of it.
So that just leads us exactly into the next question is, do you have any suggestions or best practices for landlords to manage their record keeping, keep track of those? I mean, if they have a lot of strata units in their portfolio, it must be hard to keep track of all of those communications.
Yeah. There's two things that I think that are important for landlords to do. The first is really basic log keeping. Having a kind of a sheet for every tenancy that is just simple notes saying, on this date, this happened. It doesn't have to be details. You're not writing a novel. This isn't, it's not likely gonna end up being read by anyone else. Though that being said, keep it professional because you never know. You might need it later on. But it is nonetheless something that is very useful when it comes back to, well, when did this happen? So basic log keeping is really, really important. One of the tools that we provide to our members is a landlord's checklist. So that's available to the members of LandlordBC under the forms section of our website. And it just goes through the very basics from when was the tenancy agreement entered into? When did you receive the application? When was the deposit taken? Keys given? Rent increases throughout the tenancy, those types of things. It doesn't cover absolutely every single possible thing that could happen during a tenancy. The reality is, if it did, it would be more than the 2 pages that it currently is. It'd probably be 10 or 20 pages, which isn't useful either. There's a thing is too much documentation. But a simple, that along with a very simple logbook that has very point form, simple things in it as to what has happened on different dates is a really good way of ensuring that if something does come up down the road, you can go back and say, oh yeah, here's the timeline. I have good records of that. On the flip side of that, we've talked about this from the point of view of landlords keeping these types of records, and we've already talked about how councils do need to keep records and communications and how they're supposed to do that. Are there any resources that you would recommend that people on council investigate?
Absolutely. We have a whole webinar recording on our YouTube channel called Record Keeping. But basically, it's a choice of where you want to store them, how you want to store them. The key fact under the Strata Property Act is you have to keep them. And then we have a handy thing that we call the Records Retention Guide that lists all the types of records you have to keep and for how long, because some things you keep for 2 years, 6 years, some things you keep permanently, and it gets really hard to remember how long you have to keep different things. So correspondence is 2 years, for example. You're allowed to keep it longer, but that's in the context of today's webinar. I'd say correspondence is the main one, but there are some other things like the Form K that's related to a tenancy. There's various records that a strata would have to keep. Does that help?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think
and there's one thing I forgot when in the questions I was asking you. There's one thing I forgot to mention is we were talking the other day about access to units. And when a strata needs to say, give a notice that, hey, the fire alarm testing is happening next week on Thursday. And we were talking about, what are the requirements for that notice? And of course, in best practices, I would say, send a copy to the tenant, send a copy to the landlord. But I looked it up. And in terms of the law, you can talk about the tenant side or the landlord side, but under the Strata Property Act, we have the standard bylaws, and the standard bylaws says the Strata Corporation has the right to access the unit on 48 hours written notice for a certain reason. So we don't even need to rely on the Residential Tenancy Act at all. But that's access for the Strata Corporation. You've got the concern about access by the landlord if they want to attend.
Exactly. And that is one of those situations where it is certainly, I think, what is my favorite term for this? There's perceived policy tension between the Residential Tenancy Act and the Strata Act, and I think that between those two, occasionally you're going to see these types of situations where say, well, they look like they clash, and perhaps on the surface, it can appear that way, certainly, but it comes down to the nuances of things like basic definitions of what a landlord is and what a strata corporation is. And the fact that, when uh, uh, a tenant enters into a tenancy that is a strata unit, there's a requirement that they essentially say that they're going to abide by the bylaws, which means they're abiding by this. And I think there's a common kind of conversation around this about, well, which act supersedes the other. It's not a question of which act supersedes the other. They're both pieces of provincial legislation. They're actually both on equal footing. Um, uh, if we're looking at legislative hierarchy, they're parallel. There's no one doesn't have necessarily greater authority than the other in generally. And if there was actual, some type of conflict between the two, some type of policy tension between the two, it would be on a case-by-case basis that those are decided. But in this situation, there isn't that while it looks like there's that type of tension between those two pieces of legislation, the reality is they are different. One is access by the landlord, one is access by the council, and by the corporation, and by the tenant entering into that tenancy, doing things like, say, signing Form K, which acknowledges that they've received and understand the bylaws, things like that. They're understanding that they are covered by that piece of legislation as well, that they are living in this space under multiple pieces of legislation. And that's where I think the complexities of this come into play. There's in residential tenancies, we look at the Residential Tenancy Act as kind of the primary piece of legislation, but it is in fact a very layered type of living arrangement when it comes to the statutes and rules that apply. The Residential Tenancy Act, Strata Property Act. There's many other pieces of legislation, local bylaws, municipal legislation, other pieces of provincial legislation, as we mentioned, PIPA, Human Rights Code, and then federal legislation as well. So it is very complex. And in this case, again, there isn't that tension can certainly appear, but it's not actually present. It's perfectly fine. That being said, this is one of those situations where I think, the owner should probably talk to council and say, okay, let's make sure that we're on the same page, and that if you are going to go into the unit for those sorts of things, let me know as well, so that I'm aware and I can kind of keep track of that sort of thing as well. And if the tenant has concerns, then we can communicate with the tenant together on this, on that kind of united front.
Yeah, absolutely. They don't want to enter into the situation where the tenant gets upset. The tenant doesn't understand. You got to feel bad for the tenant. They don't know all these pieces of legislation, and all they know is someone's coming in the unit. So maybe it's a good idea for them to understand that, yeah, the law says that the strata can come in, but only for this reason.
Exactly. And I do think the other thing to be aware of, and a thing that I think often ends that causes those types of conflict between tenants and owners, tenants and corporations, and landlords and council, is that kind of thing that often does happen, I think, unfortunately, where a tenant says, oh, well, you can't come in because of this, and they say that to council, and council says, well, no, we can talk to your landlord. And the landlord says, well, I didn't receive any communication on this, I don't know what's going on, talk to council. You're going to have a very frustrated tenant in that situation. So it's important that those types of communications happen early, and that those types of things are contemplated kind of thoroughly.
Well, sorry if I got us sidetracked. I'll let you keep going on our outline here for the.
Yeah, well, I think that we are now, we've kind of gone through what we've prepared. I think, when we look at what we've kind of talked about so far today, we've really highlighted the importance for both the kind of very clear requirements for communication. There's obviously very specific requirements for both landlords and tenants under multiple pieces of legislation when it comes to communication, but also that need for just general transparent communication and making sure that everyone's kind of on the same page. We could talk probably several hours today about all of the individual specific requirements, and that's fine, and that's good, and that's important to be aware of. But at the end of the day, none of that really matters if you end up in a high conflict situation with any of these parties, because what you did is not just have general, open, kind of transparent communication, especially from the beginning. Building that type of relationship, building trust, is really important in these types of situations, on everyone's front.
Yeah, a lot of things are preventable.
Exactly. I think, we at LandlordBC, we've always said, communication is a key to prevent situations and, negative situations. So certainly. Before we get into questions, just that have kind of come in from you, our attendees, really appreciate that. I see lots of questions have come in. That's really, really important. Make sure to watch your email as well for information about our next session, which will be March 23rd. So you enroll in that, which will be on resolving conflicts. So essentially when communication breaks down.
Well, and complaints. That whole
exactly.
Complaints and conflict, which of course,
exactly.
One feeds the other.
So going through the questions that we have that have been submitted here, there are quite a few. The first question I kind of want to bring up um, is essentially exactly what we were just talking about. What are the specific reasons that would allow a strata to enter a tenanted property?
Well, the act says that you have to check your bylaws because it's actually in the bylaws, not the act. But what it says is permit entry to a strata lot. An owner, tenant, occupant, or visitor must allow a person authorized by the strata to enter the strata lot. The first part is in an emergency without notice to ensure safety or prevent significant loss. So that's usually there's a fire on the stove and you've left the building and gone to the store, or your tub has overflowed and the poor person below has a stream of water pouring through their ceiling. That's a true emergency. So we have to carefully interpret as strata councils what does the word emergency mean, because you can't just enter that tenanted lot for not good reason. But then the other half of this is in a non-emergency, again, that authorized person can at a reasonable time on written notice go in, but only specifically to inspect, repair, or maintain common property or common assets or any portions of the strata lot that the strata corporation has to reasonably repair or maintain or insure under the act. So that's actually a lot of things, because the whole unit ends up being insured by the strata corporation's policy. So basically, you need to come in to fix the heating or do a smoke alarm testing, or it's those types of things. You're not getting access to go in and just be a looky-loo and look around their apartment. That would be an invasion of privacy and definitely a breach where the council just can't legally go in for any reason. But it's all in the bylaw. So just read standard bylaw 7 and check your own bylaws to see if it's been amended. But most of the time, most stratas haven't amended that bylaw.
Yeah, that first reason for entry that you mentioned around emergencies is actually, it's the same wording essentially in the Residential Tenancy Act as well about entering units. So, both pieces of legislation very clearly, identify that there are going to be situations that are going to fall outside of, there are going to be emergencies. So yeah, certainly.
And the most common is a water leak.
Yeah.
And it's got to be a serious water leak.
Yes. Yeah. If what we're talking about is a slow drip, generally no. If what we're talking about is water flowing through, yeah, that's big. And I mean that in between part is where it becomes difficult. And I think that is a difficult position to be in as to what is an emergency. But it comes down to kind of trying to use your best judgment. So a question has come up is, if a landlord has hired a rental property manager, how does the rental manager fit in the chain of communication between council, tenant, landlord?
Yes.
Any thoughts from you? I know I have some thoughts as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'll just say briefly, there's the language in the Strata Property Act doesn't always say owner. It often says owner or landlord. So if you have to give a communication to the owner, it always says owner or landlord. And basically that is taking that into a comment, into consideration, is that sometimes the owner has actually hired someone to be the landlord. So that's where it's up to, in my view, that's where it's up to the owner of the strata lot. When they say to the strata, here's the contact person for my strata lot, it might not always be the owner. The only problem is that the strata has to understand there are different situations that may not be related to the rental itself, where they still have to inform the owner, like notice of an annual general meeting. So it's a bit complicated. There, again, from the strata's point of view, there's going to be, say, situations where we contact that manager of the strata lot who's managing the rental. And there'll be other situations where we might be legally required to contact the owner. So you just, you know, it's almost like you have to have a list of each. But it
Yeah,
really, really depends on what has that owner given you as a strata. If they haven't given you the correct information, it's not the strata's fault.
certainly, certainly. Again, that comes down to just making sure that there's good communication between those parties. And I mean, this is all backed up, of course, by the Residential Tenancy Act as well, that defines a landlord as the owner, but also potentially as the agent of an owner, and that could be a licensed property manager. It could be just a family member on occasion. That's actually not really uncommon. Um, so so certainly, it's not uncommon to have someone act on behalf of, but in those situations, it really just as with your tenant, you need to make sure that everyone is kind of understands who to contact in those situations. And I think also, it's reasonable to go to council in that situation. And obviously, if I were an owner in that situation and I had a property manager, I would likely request that any communication that goes to the property manager from council is also coming to me as well, so I have a record of that. Because, at the end of the day, I'm the owner. And it's my responsibility and my investment. Um,
So that's a bit of a burden on the Strata Council, especially with self-managed. That would mean,
mhm,
we've got to notify the tenant, the landlord, and the owner. But I think you're right. In an ideal world, that could prevent a lot of conflict down
yeah,
the road if you're able to remember, if you've got a list and you're able to remember, yeah, we have to notify all three.
yeah,
But again, it depends what the communication is. There's some things that the strata, it would not be appropriate to send certain letters, like an increase in strata fees. You don't send that to the tenant. And
no,
the landlord would probably get pretty upset if you did, and for good reason. But in that
yeah,
case, the Strata Property Act very clearly says that you notify the owner. It doesn't say owner or tenant. So again, it's almost like you need to have the Strata Property Act and the Tenancy Act on your computer all the time
yeah,
and double check the wording.
yeah. The other thing too is, I mean, another question that's going to come up is it reasonable to have, um, the only contact person being the property manager? Um, and I would say that the answer there is, I mean, you can certainly assign those types of responsibilities, but you want to make sure that your manager is aware of what they're doing, and that because generally property managers are there to often primarily manage that residential tenancy. So they're doing more than that. Then I can make sure that's in your agreement with them, and that they're aware of what is expected of them.
And that's permitted under the act. So for example, if you had to give the notice of an AGM and somebody doesn't live in the strata, there's only two ways to give official notice of that to that owner, and it's to whatever mailing address they have provided outside the strata, or to hand it to them in person. So they could, and of course, they're not around usually, so you can't hand it to them. So the one method is by mail to that owner. So it depends what address the owner has given. And if the only address they've given to the strata is the mailing address of their manager of their rental unit, then that's okay. The strata has been given a mailing address, and that's the address they use. So if it
Uh,
goes to the manager, that's, the owner, those are the instructions the owner gave.
exactly. Um, a question that's come up here is, this is a live situation. A strata council needs to send a letter to an owner whose tenant had a gathering last night, um, and the last vehicle left at 4 a.m. Should council CC the tenant on the correspondence? Now, I'm assuming, though it's not said, I'm going to make an assumption here that this gathering was not just a quiet, nice, friendly gathering, that perhaps it was a little raucous and caused a disruption to other occupants, especially with people leaving at 4 a.m. Uh, uh, so this sounds like likely what we're talking about is a noise complaint, really. So should council CC the tenant on that correspondence?
It's
Or
it's the opposite. bylaw enforcement under the Strata Property Act, when there's a tenant involved, if the tenant broke the bylaw or is alleged, I should say alleged, if a tenant allegedly broke a bylaw or a rule, you're dealing with a bylaw enforcement process with the tenant, and you're keeping the landlord informed, because the Act says you have to give a copy of that communication to the landlord. That's different if the landlord broke a bylaw. Then you're doing bylaw enforcement with them. And if that's the case, you wouldn't CC, like if the owner didn't pay their strata fees and they're facing fines for not paying strata fees, you wouldn't copy the tenant because it's the owner who broke the bylaw. But if it's the tenant who is being enforced, then you just have to inform the owner. And this is a common mistake where a bylaw enforcement process goes all the way through, where they've assumed that the landlord is the one being fined, and it gets completely thrown out, because if you look at the Act, it very clearly says that you're enforcing the process with the tenant and copying to the owner.
Yeah. And that's really important.
Yeah, we'll get into that in detail in the next webinar when we're talking about
exactly
complaints and conflict. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is, I think, just taking, let's see if there's other kind of communication type questions. Actually, just a question for you as well, around, you mentioned there was a template for the members. Just to clarify, that is a template for VISOA members for Strata Council privacy policies. So you provide that. Yeah, so that is on the VISOA website.
And if people can't find it, just send me an email, President. I'll put it. Don't know if I can find it.
We're going to send it. We'll send it out in the follow-up as well.
In the email. Okay, perfect. Yeah. But if anybody's listening, it's just president@visoa.bc.ca.
Yeah. I guess one more question here. Can you not send notification of an AGM by email? This is kind of outside of the landlord tenant thing, but it has popped up, and I figure we can probably get that quickly.
You only can use email if the person has signed or gives some sort of formal authorization to say, I want all my official notices, records, and documents that are required, that the Act says that the Strata Corporation is required to give me, to this email address. If they haven't given you, you can't, just because you have someone's email address doesn't mean you can use it for official notices. So quite often people are getting served their notice by, or receive their notice by email, and you can't. And if the person lives outside of the strata, which is what we're talking about today with landlords, it's not permitted at all. So you really have to check, I think it's section 61 of the Strata Property Act that lists the permitted methods of giving notice by the strata. And you'll be quite surprised that email is not what you would, I mean, keep in mind, this was written in 1998. So it hasn't stopped with technology, but I know you've had a recent change in a couple of years ago with your use of email addresses for tenants too. So, I mean, at least yours is catching up. Ours isn't.
Kind of. Actually, I would say that ours is very much in line with yours as well. In that, first of all, the change, I have been working in this industry for nearly 16 years. When I started in this industry, I recall there being a push from the residential tenancy office at the time, as it was called, not the residential tenancy branch as it is now. And they said email is going to become a method of service. And that was 16 years ago. But it was only 2 years ago that it actually became a method of service. But it is the same as in with stratas. It's only in situations where email has been provided, the email address has been provided to the other party with the express consent that it be used as a method of service. Of course, there's a form available from the residential tenancy branch that helps document that. And that's great. And a lot of people sign that, both landlords and tenants sign that. to set up email as a method of service between themselves. That's great, but it's not a requirement. It's not just a given in residential tenancies. That requirement for consent for email to be used is still in place, just as it is with your legislation. And that is it's fine, but it does I think it's one of those situations where we take for granted how often and how simple it is to simply send an email. Uh, and occasionally there are pieces of legislation, these two pieces of legislation, where it isn't that simple. Uh, uh, so certainly, be careful about using email as a method of service. It's not don't use email as a method of service. Just make sure that in your situation you can. Uh, And when you're communicating something that's really, really important as well, if I were advising a landlord about, say, ending a tenancy, which obviously we don't want to have to get to that point in any situation, but it does, of course, it does happen from time to time. I would probably recommend that landlord not use email as a method of service if they can avoid it. If they can serve that directly to the tenant, or through a different method where proof of service and there's less questions about service can come up, then I would generally recommend those other methods. Um, so there is another question um, here just around uh, uh, kind of uh, uh, a situation where there's been some security breaches at a property. Essentially, people are there's it appears that there's inadequate security at the building um, uh, around and things from a patio or a terrace have been taken. It's the tenants' belongings that have been taken, and potential attempts at a break-in as well. So in that situation, um, uh, you know, uh, what type of communication is needed? Like, who does the tenant communicate directly to the Strata Council? Can the uh, I mean, I understand how it would work in the residential tenancy, obviously. So what does that look like? And obviously, that's perhaps maybe just a kind of segue to our next session, but resolving disputes. But can you give us just a kind of general glimpse?
In general, and please, for the person who asked the question, know that without a lot of specifics, it's hard to answer this, but I'll answer it generally for the group. Is that if something is related to a crime, your Strata Council is not the appropriate body. They do not enforce crime. The only thing that they can do is look and see if a bylaw has been broken. And remember that if a bylaw has been broken, the only thing that they have that they can do is eventually levy a fine. So if there's a problem where there's a break-in, that's absolutely call the police.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a problem where your car has been broken into, inform your insurance company. Like, that has nothing to do with the Strata Council at all. It's nice for them to know if there's security issues because it may not be a one-off. For example, what happens often is somebody props open the front door of the lobby. So that's something that is behavior where, the Strata Council could say, look, we're going to send a notice to the entire building and say, please, everyone, don't prop open the door, for security, make sure the door is fully closed when you enter and leave. But it's not up to the council to be police. It's not their role. And the same thing with the Strata manager. If the fob system breaks or a door isn't closing properly, then yeah, that's something they can do. It's maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
But anything that's actually related to a crime, it's the police.
Certainly. Okay, well, that brings us to an end of our session today. So thank you so much to everyone on our call today, on our webinar today. Really appreciate your attention today, your thoughtful questions. and for taking the time to inform yourselves of the complexities that exist within these types of tenancies. There's a lot of information, I know, so I really appreciate the attention to this. Also really want to thank you, Wendy, so much for participating in these webinars. It's great to be able to work with you in these last 3 sessions, and look forward to our next.
I think the next one is going to be very well attended because we get so many questions about the complaints process, the bylaw enforcement process. So for the people who had that on their mind today, I really encourage you to come to the next one, March 23rd.
Certainly. Again, thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day, and we'll see you next time.